Hello, souls and demons, and welcome back to the portal. Today's story is called More Than Echoes, written by StygianSagas. So, sit back, grip your seats, and enjoy. As a civil inspector in Ohio, I spent most of my time scouring overpasses and government building projects. If there was a fault on a foundation or an oversight on a public blueprint, it was my job to sniff it out. The work was dull but straightforward, and I liked it that way. I wouldn't get rich, but the position was comfortable, and I could leave my house each morning secure in the knowledge that today would be much like yesterday. That comfort was stolen from me in the spring of 2019 by Cincinnati's derelict subway tunnels, and I haven't worked a day in civil inspection since. In the early morning hours of March 3rd, a tiptoeing earthquake rattled windows in Georgetown, a small community along the Kentucky border. It was so subtle that most residents weren't roused from sleep. A passing shudder of this table or that floor lamp, all that spoke to the creeping seismic activity beneath the soil. Generally, this wouldn't have meant anything to a Cincinnati-based civil inspector living 40 miles away, but cruel circumstance would make it my problem. Someone associated with the city government, whose home was along the Brighton Avenue, started raising stink about a dip in the roadway that jolted the passing traffic. Supposedly, the problem was a sudden development. The word about the tiny Georgetown tremor reached Cincinnati, and suddenly every voice in local government was ablaze with references to structural stability, theorizing about sunken ground or displaced earth. The long-abandoned, half-completed subway system beneath the city ran right under Brighton, which only served to throw more fuel on the fire. Despite the fact there had been no measurable tremors in Cincinnati, it was fast decided by people with frayed nerves and few wits that an inspection was needed. No one wanted to be the one who was fingered for doing nothing if anything went wrong. So dollars would have to be spent to see if a minuscule earthquake had managed to shatter several feet of concrete from 40 miles away. When straws were drawn to see who would get that not-so-illustrious job, my name came up. Though I didn't see any reason to justify the city's worry, I wasn't about to turn down burning through a paid afternoon strolling an empty tunnel for my wages. I've tried to work out an excuse I could have used to escape that ill-fated patrol, but there was no way for me to know what lay in store for me. In my mind, this was yet another case of an easy day for easy pay, and I make it my habit not to question easy pay. The day started out innocuous enough. Sunny, unseasonably warm, relatively quiet. I took the keys I'd been given to the large, gated entrance near I-75, the rumble of passing traffic muffling any reservations I might have about the tunnel that waited beyond. Only when the large metal doors swung shut behind me and the roaring traffic dwindled to a stifled drone did I feel apprehension. There are two parallel tracks making up the larger portion of the completed tunnels, separated by a large central concrete wall. The wall is punctuated here and there with cramped 6-foot-high access passages, meant to give maintenance crews the ability to slip from one to the other on foot. There was very little actual railway though, the money having dried up far before the final stages of construction. Even the graffiti felt old and outmoded, for the city had stepped up security at the locked entrances 2 decades ago in the interest of safety, much to the chagrin of wandering teenagers and cold homeless residents, I'm sure. Light spilled in from the metal grate above the doors at my back, but was fast swallowed by the yawning mouth of the tunnel ahead. The noise of each breath I took seemed to cascade down, its darkened interior like applause, amplifying each rise and fall, each scuffle of my hands against denim as I raised a flashlight from my belt and banished a bit of the shadow. My first step sent a stray stone skipping along the time-stained concrete and, foolish as I knew it was, my heart leapt at the sound. I forced myself to move forward, keeping myself distracted by scouring the ceiling for cracks or degradation in the roof, and scanning the paint-spattered walls for signs of failure. But I never quite got comfortable. Each footstep sent ripples of sound through the dark. Rats scampered the floor at the edges of my sight, fleeting shadows within the shadow. And their muffled pattering seemed almost deafening to me. Though I had no reason to fear, I became conscious of the fact that I was trying to minimize the noise, almost tiptoeing through the tunnel. My eyes constantly darted for those gaping black passageways in the dividing wall that led to the adjacent track, as if I expected to catch movement of the obscure tunnel beyond. I never saw anything but the wriggling shapes of rodents, aside from the almost imperceptible rumble of distant trucks overhead. I heard no human sound save my own in the subway. Perhaps it was this paradoxical loneliness beneath the bustling city that made me feel like such an invader, I told myself. Gradually, a station opened up before me, with the dividing wall between the tracks dying away and the platforms rising up to either side. Stairways disappeared into solid concrete ceilings, filled in the better part of a century ago when the city ceased production. I felt a bit better here, somehow less threatened in the open expanse of the derelict station. It was a far cry from the confined tunnels and the mental images of lurking figures, conjured up by that barren dividing wall. I clambered up onto the nearest platform, the largest in the station, and scanned the steadfast walls, finding little of note save the preponderance of genitalia amongst the graffiti. There was no sign of wear and tear, the old construction having been built to last. I tapped it with my knuckles absently as I moved along, a barely audible tribute to the last century's engineers, who had built such an underappreciated and indestructible bunker. Again, it struck me just how silly the trip down here had been. My eyes found a sort of ratty clothes heap across the tracks, then just a vague silhouette in the distant darkness. I made my way across to the opposing platform, curious as to what had been left behind in the urban tomb after all these years. As it moved into view, I saw mounted blankets and twisted jackets, matted and filthy with neglected age. I saw a low ring of old bricks, the bones of a makeshift fire pit which hadn't hosted wood in ages. Finally, I saw the beaten old steno pad off to the side, stained and dog-eared, and the haphazard writing sprawled across its pages. I don't know exactly what compelled me to take up the little pad and start to flip through. I had already decided that my task was pointless, so I'm sure a little boredom played a role. I had hours to burn down there, and I wasn't about to find a gaping chasm in the roof. Regardless, I began to read. As I went, what little comfort I took in the open space of the subway station slowly trickled away. An ink aged so greatly by exposure to the predations of vermin and temperature that its flow was almost lost. The first few pages of stilted, aggressive penmanship tell of how the writer had ended up alone in the tunnels. By his account, the writer had dwelt there for many years, with a group of vagrants during the 80s and 90s. When authorities had warned the squatters that the tunnels would soon be locked off, he had stubbornly opted to hide in the deepest portion of the ruins, evading notice while the rest packed what little they had and moved on. When the barriers clanged shut, he'd crept back to his accustomed spot on the platform, determined to either survive on a combined diet of stolen canned goods and trapped rat, or die in his own terms in the tunnels. There was only cursory information about what led to his presence there, however. Apparently, he had only begun writing at all because he believed someone else to be in the tunnels with him, and suspected they were rifling through his camp while he was away. He frequently addresses whoever's banging around in the main tunnel at night, or the man in the tunnel, with the ending to his introductory pages reading, "If you're sitting in my camp reading this while I scrounge for rats near their entrance, do yourself a favor and either make yourself known, or keep to your part of the subway. I have a gun on me, and it'd be a bad idea to spook me at night. Several entries, perhaps made each day, detail how the man in the tunnel continues to scatter stones before going quiet at odd hours of the night, or mumble not quite right words he can't decipher which echo around the subway system. The speech was described as sounding deaf, as if the speaker were slightly mistaken and atonal but couldn't detect the difference. Never could he catch a glimpse of this person. The 1 weak flashlight he had on him couldn't reach far down the tunnel, and his unwanted guest always seemed to go silent as soon as the rider was awakened or alerted by the noise. Then comes the 4th entry, when things get very eerie. An old cat who had come down to the tunnels through a tiny grate to hunt rats and poke around his camp, dubbed Ollie by the writer, had been missing for the day of the prior entry. The writer had taken to calling for him whenever he came into the tunnels or got up from his perch on the platform to stretch his legs. When on that second day the writer finally managed to drift off, he was awakened by faint, distant calling from far off down the tunnels. Again, he described it as slightly off, as if spoken over chewed food. He swears in the notebook that the voice was calling Ollie over and over, in much the same tone and rhythm that he had called the name before. He laments in the entry that he had no way of contacting the world beyond the subway gates, and mentions that he is going to attempt staying awake for the next couple of days, perhaps now writing more for his own security of mind than for his assumed visitor. Though I can't know how long passes between the penultimate entry and the final, strange encounter described in the last pages. I believe it to be no more than a day later given its phrasing and flow. The writer, apparently dazed by lack of sleep in front of the small fire he'd made on the platform, and rocking back and forth to keep awake, was surprised by a noise just above him. From the ceiling of the platform, on edge and holding the small revolver he carried in his lap, he raised the weapon almost reflexively, and saw outlined by the fire what he describes as some big-ass, pale, naked guy hanging from the ceiling. The person, though I think thing might be the better term, was looking down at him, and was moving to climb to the floor when he shot it. It wailed, a sound he describes as wet and weird. The thing then dropped to the floor and skidded with inhuman speed off the platform and down the tunnel, disappearing before he could stand to line up another shot. It was something the homeless population in the tunnels had called the Long Man, the writer said, a kind of tall tale the oldest of them used to tell. He'd always assumed it was hearsay like the others. Maybe it had been there all along, he speculated, becoming bold when the population of squatters fell to just one lonely soul. Heartened by the fact that he had heard whoever or whatever had been lurking in the tunnel, he records that he is going to follow the blood this long man left in the tunnel as it fled and see if he can't find and kill it. Then the journal ended. The nameless man who penned it in the dark lost the remaining empty pages. I sat there crouched in the dark corner of the ruins of the fire pit for some time, soaking in the story it told. I found myself throwing furtive glances across the platform to the looming tunnels, conscious of the occasional scuttling rat. This, I told myself, was an excellent bit of theatrical fiction. Whoever had written it left it here years back, in a place that was bound to put visitors on edge. There had been a real Lovecraft amongst the squatters in the station to have pulled that little tale off, I thought. As I tried to shake away my nerves and restore what little comfort I built up in the yawning subway station, I put the little notepad back down in its place. Fool that I was, I dismissed my worries, consigned the story to the world of fiction, and strode back to the tracks. Looking back on that return to the tunnels and the first steps along the route to the second station, I do think the story made an impression on me, whether I dismissed it or not. Each step upon the concrete was cautious and measured, and I took care to steer clear of broken glass or pooled water that might ring out beneath my tread. Distracting myself with observant glances at a roof I knew would yield no scars. I reassured myself that it was only a couple miles until the end of the line. Then it'd be back to the surface to tell the city where it could shove its earthquake theory of pothole development. The shadows seemed deeper and the rats seemed more numerous, my mind reading foreboding menace where I assured myself there was none. Much as I told myself I was being foolish, I couldn't make myself calm down entirely. I almost made to whistle or mutter to myself, just to break the silence and prove myself a fool. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. I just kept my head down and moved along. It was only when I came into view of the second stop along the tunnel that I was given pause. Somewhere in the gloom up ahead, barely captured beneath the waving beam of my light, a snap of motion caught my eye, just visible across the intervening 100 yards or so. In a flash, it sank behind an intervening concrete pillar and out of view near the farther tunnels. I froze, processing the motion, my head spinning as I went through an animalistic on-the-spot internal debate over whether to cut out the light and try to hide. Though it had only been visible for a moment, I could have sworn the thing that moved was ahead, lurching backward out of view. It took me a moment to gather myself, but I was emboldened rather than frightened when I heard a stone clatter in the distant tunnel. I strode forward, light in hand, speaking for the first time since closing myself into the echoing vault. "Hey!" I shouted. "Whoever's up there, I'm not here to run you off." The words of my supervisor came to mind, a warning to watch out for vagrants in the tunnels. Suddenly my mind felt at ease, giving a familiar shape to the nervous tension I'd felt in the dark. I had no idea how a homeless resident would have found their way back in there, but perhaps I'd found the fiction writer from the prior platform. "I'm here to check for damage," I told the empty air, my voice amplified by the soaring arched ceilings. "I'll be in and out fast as can be." I moved out into the station, the echoes of my footfall once again deafening. I shined my light into the oncoming tunnel, but saw nothing save dust and distant darkness beneath the beam. I scanned the platforms and saw this junction was much as the same as the last, vacant and gaping. Only several trash heaps and scattered hunks of debris littered the ground, and the ceilings were as sturdy as they'd ever been. Again I called out to the darkness, and again no response came. I spent a moment debating whether to proceed, but ended up deciding against an early retreat from the tunnels. After all, I was familiar with the overpasses and derelict buildings of the city, and I was no stranger to squatters. If I didn't bother them, they wouldn't bother me. That's what I kept telling myself, at least, forcing each step and scanning every aperture in the dividing wall between the tracks. There were more debris from construction here, with piles of pallets and bundled piping pressed up against the dingy walls. I made an effort not to pry too much, keeping my eyes forward, hoping whatever homeless person I'd spotted just sat tight and let me get my ill-advised rounds over with. I spoke now and then, laughing off the futility of the search for flaws in the structure, making sure I made my position known in the dark. "Stupid I'm even down here, really," I told the dusty, stifled air. "Managerial shit. Big waste of city dollars. What can you do, though?" The words were torrential in the confines of the subway, but I felt more secure. I wouldn't be sneaking up on anyone in here, and now that I was convinced there was an occupant, that was my best bet to keep the day simple and straightforward. I wasn't about to rock up on some spooked homeless guy in the dark. The more I thought about it, though, the more uncomfortable I became. As concrete as the simple idea of squatters had been, and as glad as I was for my apparent solitude in the tunnel, I couldn't reconcile one thing. The longer I walked, the more it gnawed at me. Until I slowed to a near crawl the better part of a mile from the second station, The last opened up before me, still and silent, and I halted the words of warning I'd been forming just as they began. Whoever it was, they had never once used a light. I'd never seen a flash in the dark or a stray beam bouncing off pooled water. What kind of squatter didn't need light? I hesitated a moment, but then second-guessed myself. As I threw a cursory glance around the empty station, I shook my head, trying to dispel some of the nervous twitching I'd become accustomed to in the tunnel. There was nothing here, and there wasn't really anything left of the tunnel system. Right ahead, where the track should have continued, they terminated in a big cinder block and cement barrier that marked the end of a polished construction. If they weren't here, they weren't anywhere. I supposed I'd just taken an odd shadow or water-stained blotch on the wall for motion in the last station. I scoffed for an audience of no one, mocking my own hasty judgment, laughing it off like I hadn't just shit my way back down the last track. I pressed forward to the barrier, feeling I owed it to myself to at least check that before I turned to go. Then I could at least try to tell myself I'd been nonchalant down the subway. It was only when I drew near, high on the feeling of relief that had flooded me when I found the last station empty, that I grew nervous. In the lower right corner of the barrier, several of the large bricks had been dislodged and shoved free, bathed in the dust of intervening years. Through the hole trickled dingy, tepid water, pooling on the empty concrete of the station's tracks. It looked too old to be freshly made, I thought. No tiny earthquake could have shaken those stones loose, anyhow. I sloshed through the shallow water, dropping to a crouch before the gap, shining my light through in search of some kind of chasm or damage. I hoped to see only the mounded rock and poured concrete of the construction team's patch job, but I wasn't to be so fortunate. Beyond, the ground grew rough, hewn rock and jagged stone over which a slow, sickly stream bubbled. It ran through a little tunnel no more roomy than a crawl space, bubbling up from some cold spring beneath the ground. It was the first real sign of wear and tear I'd seen down here, but it left me with far more questions than answers. The tunnel had apparently been plotted with the aim to steer clear of the river. The construction must have grazed a subterranean spring, I wagered, perhaps without the notice of the original planners. The years had done the rest, eating through a path towards the derelict barrier. The water would have had to work fast, though. Could it even have carved the little creek bed that quickly? And how in the world had it shifted to cinder blocks off the wall? Perhaps there was a homeless resident in the tunnels, I reasoned. He'd broken the wall in search of water, maybe having heard the murmur of the stream from the station. I nodded to myself, working it out in my head. Then, at the end of my vision, something moved at the rear of the spring-fed stream. Just above the waterline, emerging from whatever crevice in the stone was vomiting forth the sour water. The beam of my light caught shine which had not been there on the initial scan. From 3 grayish-white shapes poking up from the water, 6 golden reflections stared back, twitching in the harsh glow of my light. Eyes. They were too broad to be a man's, too reflective in the dark. I stumbled back when they blinked out, the owners having flinched away from the beam. Raccoons or big rats, I tried to tell myself, rising to my feet and putting a few more yards between myself and the hole. That rationalization didn't stop me from pulling the cheap little utility knife from my belt, grasping it so tightly in my free hand that my nails drew blood from my palm. They'd have to have been very, very large raccoons. Moreover, the pale shapes in the water had been wrong, rounded and broad, too much like a person's skull. I made for the far tunnels, throwing a few shaky glances over my shoulder toward the gap, though I was still busy trying to convince myself I'd been spooked by animals on the one hand. Other parts of my brain calculated the distance to the far exit. I'd cursed that I'd been given a key only for the one gate, and lacked the keys for other access doors built near the stations. It was when I reached the other end of the station that I heard a slight, subdued vocalization from behind me, only reverberating to my ears due to the vaulted construction overhead. In a shaken, awkward tone that brought to mind the faded pages of the filthy stenopad, a twisted parody of the words, "What can you do?" echoed out into the tunnels. The words were without inflection or emphasis, clearly organic but spoken with all the mood of a text-to-speech device. They were all wrong. The words of a child phonetically reading out a sentence they couldn't understand. There was no tenderness or clumsy comedy in them, though. Only cold, detached interest. I ran, not yet daring to look back. I made it perhaps 100 yards down the tunnel when, just as I began to believe I'd be left alone, there was a clamor farther back along the tracks. Though it took me a moment to place it over the noise of my booted footfalls in the stifled darkness, I eventually deciphered the noise. The slap of many bare feet upon concrete. My pace quickened, pressing me to the limit of my physical ability. I cursed that I let myself slip out of shape, damning myself with weekends off spent lounging around at home with a book in hand. But the adrenaline helped push me along. Only when I could hear the nameless things gaining in the dark did I make a gamble. Without slowing my pace, I dug through one of the holes in the dividing wall. I hoped beyond hope that whatever was close on my heels hadn't fanned out in both tunnels. I flicked off my light as I crossed on shaky legs to the far wall, cautiously feeling my way into a crevice between the concrete and some stacked filthy wooden pallets, and held my breath. The fleshy sound of the footsteps swept past down the other tunnel, half muffled by the intervening wall. They were as odd as the voice had been, unlike the rhythm of a regular sprinter, as if every few steps were punctuated by leaps or scuttling crouches. Imagination did the work my shadow-blinded eyes could not in the all-consuming gloom, giving twisted forms to the capering horde as they wound further away down the track. Though my initial mood was relief, it was not to last. First, I thought of escape. With only one exit available to me, I felt cornered. The things now between me and the distant exit. Even if they'd pass me by for now, what chance did I have of slipping past whatever those watchers in the stream were in the dark? There were more immediate threats, though. Only a heart-rattled minute or two after their passage, a noise reached back to me from where the mob had run. A sort of sonorous clicking, like a tongue off the roof of the mouth. It echoed down the tunnels and, after a brief pause, was answered. No echo could muddle the fact that the responder was frightfully close in the dark. Perhaps 20 feet off. The most disconcerting thing, though, was that the noise came from above. Again, it sounded. Many such noises joined in. Most were distant and scattered, but the one nearest to me was methodical, purposeful. It shifted from one side of the tunnel to the other, unseen limbs scraping across stone with cautious, barely audible grace. I stifled each breath, ears strained, every hair on my body standing on end as I braced for whatever came next. It came lower, clicking all the while. I recall thinking it had to be directly above me, on the wall of the tunnel I huddled against. I froze as best I could, restraining a jolt of fright as some tiny fragment of stone or debris was dislodged in the dark and clattered to the ground beside my arm. There was one final click, loud as thunder to my ears, then silence. What came after happened in a flash, but my experience of it is sticky and slow, stretched wide by tension. I waited for a breathless eternity, expecting each moment a miraculous resumption of the clicking which never came. My knuckles must have been blanched white in the dark against the knife, every muscle in my body tensed like coiled wire. when the hand brushed against my throat in the dark. I don't think the grasping thing on the wall knew what I was. It was probing, suspicious but not decisive. I didn't give it time to figure out, though. I would like to say I put a bold plan of action into motion, reacting just as planned when the cold, unseen fingers grazed my skin. I reacted in a blur of spastic flailing, though. Still, it likely saved my life. The ropey, spinely thing above my head had come quite close, and I got lucky with the jab I made in the dark. My knife found purchase, leaving my hand wet with warm, irony blood. I wasted no time in drawing back, hitting the grasping thing again and again and again, within the span of a few seconds. As if just finding its voice, the thing screeched. I can't describe the raw power of the noise, far louder than any gunshot I've heard. The cry ruptured my right eardrum and left my head spinning with near concussive force. There was a clattering of limbs as it fell, rolling from on top of me to the ground beside the pallets, rasping and thrashing. I was stricken several times, fracturing a couple of ribs in the process, but in the rush of the moment, I didn't feel the clumsy, desperate strikes as any more than dull thumps. I scrambled to my feet, backed away along the wall and panicked. Fortunately for me, my addled brain made the right call in the moment. I resolved to flee, with the light on, knowing there were others in the tunnels who would know my position. What was not fortunate, though, was that my light first fell upon the thing that grasped me in the dark, giving me a clear glimpse of what that forgotten rider with his stenopad had termed the Long Man. This was an apt name. It was too stretched, too elongated, too see-through. Its organs and veins were visible in the beam, black against the milky pallor of the semi-transparent skin. Far taller than a human being, it was wiry but light, likely weighing no more than I did. Its hands, oversized and sporting flexible tapering fingers, clutched at a cluster of open wounds along its neck and chest, which pulsed blackish blood at each pump of its dying heart. Its eyes, two impossibly large orbs above a wicked toothed mouth and a skeletal flattened nose, found mine. They were a shocking amber and almost comically wide, frightened. I can't forget the sight of the thing, much as I've tried. Though it was only a startled second that I looked upon its dying form, I know I'll remember every shady detail until my final days. Still, it served to shock me into motion. I wheeled about and ran for the exit, aware of the scattered screeches and clicks in the tunnels as other long men closed on my position. I kept expecting them to pour from the holes in the dividing wall, or to drop down from the ceiling above like leaping spiders. They never interfered, though, at least not directly. I can't know whether it was because of the thing's dying cry, or some other reason. I assume they were wary, averse to taking a risk. Though they certainly could have killed me, my lucky break with the first hunter must have made them anxious. Rather than grasping hands or screeching charges, I caught only flashes of pale motion at the edge of the light, and the whistle of thrown rocks clattering off the walls. A few of these hit me, grazing my head and bruising my legs, but I was fortunate. My passage through the second station and the further halls were a blur of harried motion, and I made the first station with little but scrapes and bruises from the bombardment. Then the assault seemed to die away. The scuttling advance of the long men, falling to a whisper, as I neared the exit and the soft glow of late afternoon came into view through the grate. I clattered against the harsh steel of the doors and scrambled with the key, stupidly trying to handle it without letting my flashlight slip from my grip. I was frayed beyond measure, then, desperate and shaking, and it took many excruciating seconds to get the door open. I slipped through, the gates squealing shut behind me, the key ready to bar the way in my wake. In the last rays of light between the closing doors, I saw the wide eyes of several inhuman hunters looking after me. their silhouettes white against the gray of the tunnels. I told my supervisors there were dangerous squatters in the tunnels, never letting the truth of the situation slip. When the police came to question me in the following days, I told them much the same, recasting the encounter as one of urban violence rather than a monstrous encounter. Though I'm sure they sent men into the tunnels, no one has ever followed up with me. I've never found it odd that the city began talks about filling in the tunnel system entirely, soon after my inspection. The attempts to rebrand the half-completed subway as a moody club or concert venue died away too, with the city largely ceasing all public reference to its moldering project. While my peers ummed and awed over why the struggling budget was being tapped for so wasteful a purpose, I kept my mouth shut. I think I know why the city, slow to awaken and slower to action, moved so suddenly to seal off the passages. I also think I know why the city moved to distance me from work, silently severing me from the job. I won't protest though, because that suits me just fine. I have no desire to ever be underground again.